Welcome to 3-Bean Chili. We're going to discuss the difference between fruits and vegetables, different portions of a plant that we eat as vegetables, a family of vegetables that we call beans, and what beans have to do with malaria. Let's get started. We've previously discussed a variety of plants or portions of plants that we eat. In this video, we're going to dive deeper into a variety of different plant parts and how and why we eat or avoid eating them. We typically think of flowers as the delicate and colorful structures common in images. You might think that flowers aren't commonly eaten and rather serve primarily a decorative purpose on the plate. But in fact, the most common flowers that we eat aren't particularly colorful or delicate. Many of the vegetables we eat, such as broccoli, cauliflower, and artichokes, are, in fact, flowers. Artichokes contain numerous phenolic compounds and are thus fairly astringent while raw. One of these, cynarin, shown here on the upper right, inhibits the sweet taste receptors on your tongue. That is, when you bite into an artichoke, some of the sweet receptors bind to the cynarin molecules. When you take the next bite of food, the cynarin is removed from the sweet taste receptor, and the receptor is much more likely to fire. This causes you to experience the second bite as significantly sweeter than the first. In fact, this effect is so strong that even a sip of water containing no sugar at all can taste sweet after eating an artichoke. Broccoli, cauliflower, and Romanesco are all varieties of cabbage whose flowers are immature and proliferate into large masses. Shown here are two heads of Romanesco broccoli with its fractal patterned flowers. So we've used the terms fruit and vegetable, but what exactly distinguishes a fruit from a vegetable? Some of the items shown here you likely consider fruits, while others you likely consider vegetables. How do you draw that distinction? I want you to pause the video and see if you can come up with the definitions for these two terms. So what distinguishes a fruit from a vegetable? Well, the answer depends on who you ask. In gardening, that is, in biology, a fruit is a seed-bearing structure that develops from the ovary of the flower, and a vegetable is any other part of the plant, such as the stems, roots, leaves, and so on. But in cooking, a fruit is a sweet plant part, while a vegetable is a savory, that is, non-sweet plant part. Note that something that fits the culinary definition of a fruit will almost always fit the botanical definition of a fruit, too. The opposite, however, is not true. That is, there are a number of botanical fruits that are not particularly sweet, and so are considered vegetables by cooks. This difference in definition between biologists and cooks gives rise to disagreements over certain foods such as tomatoes. The biologist says a tomato is a fruit because it's the ripened ovary of the flower and contains seeds, while the cook says it's a vegetable because it's not sweet. There are, of course, some fruits, such as peaches, and some vegetables, such as radishes, that both groups can agree on. Of the various fruits that cooks treat as vegetables, most require cooking to make them interesting or soft enough to eat. These include eggplant, squash, chilies, olives, pumpkin, okra, and corn, amongst others. The main exceptions are tomatoes and cucumbers. These two are often eaten raw, although tomatoes are also often cooked in dishes such as sauces or pizza. There are a couple of reasons why this first group of vegetables are generally cooked. The first is to simply make them easier to eat by softening that tough, fibrous tissue. The second is that because these fruits generally store energy in the form of starches rather than simpler sugars, and these large starch molecules are largely tasteless because they're too large to bind to our taste receptors. Cooking allows some of these starches to be broken down into smaller, simpler sugars. These simpler sugars are much smaller, and so they do bind much more readily to our taste receptors, and so the cooked fruits can taste much sweeter than the raw fruits do. Now, what I mean by taste sweeter isn't that the dish becomes dessert-like or that the main flavor component is in fact the sweetness, rather that the sweetness increases enough that the fruit becomes much more palatable. Let's turn to one particular family of plants, the nightshade family. This group of plants include capsicums, eggplant, tomato, and tomatillo, in addition to nightshade, the plant for which the group is named. Like nightshade, many members of this family stockpile significant concentrations of chemical defenses, often the bitter alkaloids. These chemical defenses cause many members of this family to be toxic to humans, but in other members, we've used selective breeding over thousands of generations to reduce the concentrations of these defenses in the edible fruits. Note, however, that since we generally aren't concerned with eating the other parts of the plant, such as the leaves, we haven't deliberately selected for lower concentrations in those parts, and so those other parts still remain toxic or deeply unpleasant to eat. The capsicums are particularly pungent examples of the nightshade family. Remember that we've discussed capsicums earlier when discussing the chili fruit that we typically include in our salsa. The capsaicin that makes chilies hot is one of these alkaloid defensive compounds common to the nightshade family. Tomatoes evolved as small, bitter berries in the deserts on the west coast of South America. We've discussed before that the climate in which a plant evolved can tell us how to store fruits and vegetables from that plant. So, where should we store tomatoes? Should we store tomatoes in the fridge, freezer, at room temperature, above room temperature? We know they evolved in the deserts of South America. Now, not all deserts are warm, as the largest desert on the planet is in fact in Antarctica. But the desert on the west coast of South America, at least where the tomato plant evolved, is a hot desert. As a result, tomatoes are best stored at room temperature. Again, tomatoes are botanically a fruit, but we treat them as a vegetable when cooking. This is largely because they have a relatively low sugar content of around 3%, as compared to around 10% for apples. Furthermore, however, tomatoes have a large glutamic acid content of about 0.3%. Note that while 0.3% sounds pretty low, especially when I just said that the 3% sugar content was low, these percentages are all relative. Remember that our taste receptors are nerve endings that fire when they bind to specific classes of molecules. As a result, the different taste receptors are effectively tuned to the normal range of concentrations of chemicals in their particular class. That is, since sugars are relatively common in much higher concentrations than glutamic acid and glutamate, the sweet receptors need substantially higher concentrations of sugars for us to experience a food as really sweet, compared to the concentrations of glutamic acid or glutamate necessary for us to experience a food as really savory. We've mentioned previously that glutamic acid and glutamate are responsible for the savory or umami taste. Meats are savory because they also contain high concentrations of glutamic acid and glutamate, so tomatoes complement this savory taste quite well. As a result, we often include tomatoes as a part of our meat dishes, such as with pizza sauce, ketchup on various meat dishes, and in spaghetti sauce. As we discussed previously, many varieties of chilies have been bred for low enough capsaicin content that they are eaten as vegetables instead of as condiments or spices. For example, bell peppers have very little capsaicin, and so we often include multiple bell pepper fruits in a single dish. Of course, we have also purposely bred varieties of chilies with very high concentrations of capsaicin for those that prefer very spicy dishes, but we tend to include those varieties in much smaller quantities rather than as the bulk of the dish. That is, we treat those varieties as condiments or spices rather than as vegetables. But capsicums also have a high concentration of cell wall pectins. What have we learned about pectins? I want you to pause the video and think about a previous topic during which we discussed pectins. What purpose did the pectin molecules serve? And how might we take advantage of that same property in dishes in which we use chili peppers? Remember that pectins were used in jams and jellies to form the gel texture as the pectin proteins bound together. With capsicums, we can chop them up or puree them, and those pectin molecules will serve a similar purpose when cooked into a sauce. The sauce texture will become quite thick and relatively gel-like, allowing our sauce to more easily stick to the remainder of the dish. Let's now turn away from the nightshade family to the Cucurbitaceae family. The Cucurbitaceae family, or the cucurbits, include fruits such as squash, cucumber, and a variety of sweet, moist melons such as watermelons. We can separate the squashes into two main types, winter squashes and summer squashes. The winter squashes are harvested in winter, by which we generally really mean they're harvested in fall for storage over the winter, and they tend to have a thick, hard outer rind that physically protects the sweet, starchy interior flesh. Those starches store lots of energy, but remember that starches are more stable than simpler carbohydrates such as mono and disaccharide sugars. So these winter squashes tend to stay edible for months, especially if kept cool, as would typically be the case during late fall and winter. The summer squashes are harvested during the summer or early fall when they're still soft and green. That is, their rind has not yet developed into the thick, hard protective layer of the winter squashes. Summer squashes, such as cucumber, tend to be less sweet, and so we often treat them as vegetables. The cucurbits are natives of relatively warm climates, and so the fruits should be kept out of the fridge. So you can leave your watermelon, cucumber, or pumpkin out at room temperature as long as you haven't yet cut it open. In addition to the edible fruits, many cucurbits also produce edible vines, flowers, and seeds. Perhaps the most commonly eaten cucurbit seed is the pumpkin seed, which is commonly roasted, similar to peanuts. Winter squashes have been grown in the Americas for a very long time, since roughly 5000 BCE. Because they have that hard, dry skin or rind, they can be kept for months. However, remember that harvested plant tissue is still alive, so the cellular metabolism of the squash will continue to slowly consume the energy stored in the form of the starch molecules as well as many other nutrients. So the winter squashes will be tastiest shortly after harvest in late fall. Most cucurbit varieties have flesh firm enough to saute or stew in chunks, but they can also be pureed to a fine consistency. The moderate sweetness of many cucurbits means that they're good for both savory and sweet preparations. For example, we'll commonly include a variety of squashes in dishes such as stews, but we'll also bake some such as pumpkin into pies. Again, the summer squashes are softer and will remain edible for only a few weeks after being picked. We have a wide variety of different summer squashes with a variety of different shapes, sizes, colors, and textures. A small selection are shown here, such as the green zucchini, yellow crookneck or yellow straightneck, and the patty pan. The most popular cucurbit is the watermelon, but the second most popular is the cucumber. We tend not to cook the cucumber, so most cucumbers are consumed either raw, as shown on the left, or pickled, as shown on the right. Okay, let's leave the cucurbits and turn to the star ingredient in our three-bean chili, the beans and peas of the legume family. We've discussed in the past about how most edible fruits evolve to be tasty for animals to allow for seed dispersals in the nutrient-rich manure the animal leaves behind after the seed passes through the digestive system. However, the legumes did not evolve this way. Most of the legumes we eat are harvested as mature, dry seeds within a pod. There are a few exceptions, however, as green beans and peas are harvested immature. That is, they haven't fully formed when we pick them. We eat these two as tender, green pod and seed, respectively. If we were to wait to harvest these, they would end up being hard and dry like the other legumes. These immature green legumes are tasty because they're still gathering sugars, amino acids, and nutrients that the seed will need to grow, but haven't yet combined them into the starches and proteins that are too large to fit onto our taste buds. We eat quite a wide variety of legumes, including, but not limited to, lima beans, kidney beans, navy bean, pinto beans, dry peas, chickpeas, garbanzo, black-eyed peas, lentils, lupins, alfalfa, soybeans, peanuts, and many more. I've shown here a few of the different varieties of legumes. Note that they come in a wide variety of different colors, sizes, and even to a certain extent, shapes. At this point, we're going to take a slight detour away from legumes to discuss vegetables originating from the lower stems and bulbs that we might include in dishes like chili. Now, we may think of the beets, turnips, radishes, and onions and other vegetables that belong to this group as being part of the root system of the plant, but they're actually the lower part of the stem of the plant from which the roots then disperse from the bottom. You can see this in a few of the images I've shown here. Note that the bulbs of the beets shown on the left have some of the roots still attached, but those roots all originate from the very bottom of the bulb. If the bulb were part of the root system, then those roots would be expected to spread out from the entire surface of the bulb rather than only from that one point at the bottom. Likewise, in the image shown on the right, the bulb of the green onion grows right at the surface of the ground, but does protrude a little bit above the ground, as would be expected of the stem. These vegetables store relatively little starch compared to most roots and tubers, such as the starchy potato. This means that they cook relatively quickly and remain moist when cooked. As we've discussed in previous videos, the starch granules, such as those in the potato, will take a significant length of time to rehydrate, and the absorption of water into those granules will make the starchy vegetable appear dry after cooking. Table beets, that is, the variety of beet that humans usually consume as an identifiable portion of the dish, contain about 3% sugar. So there is some sweetness to them, but they're not overly so. In comparison, the typical apple contains roughly 10% sugar. The larger beets we use for animal feed are about 8% sugar, and this serves to pack more calories into the feed so the animals grow faster. Relatively recently, in terms of evolution at least, as it has occurred in the last 200 years or so, sugar beets have been produced via selective breeding to have about 20% sugar. It's from these high sugar beets that we have begun to purify granulated sugar or table sugar, as we discussed in a previous video. The biological functions of a plant's stem are to transport water and nutrients between the roots and the leaves, and to provide structural support for the weight of the leaves. This means that they have long, stiff tubes for nutrient transport and tough, fibrous material for support. But these long, stiff tubes and fibers provide a challenge for cooks because they tend to make the food chewy and stringy. This effect worsens as the plant stem matures, since the weight of the leaves gets heavier and heavier as the plant matures. To hold up that increased weight, the stem gets wider, stiffer, and tougher. That is, the concentration of these stiff fibers that provide structural support goes up. If we allow the plant to grow for long enough, the stem becomes woody and extremely tough, like the trunk of a tree or a bush. One of these vegetables, asparagus, is eaten as a stalk which supports leaf-like bracts at the tip where photosynthesis occurs. The asparagus grows as shoots from underground rhizomes. That is, a mature plant like the one shown on the right, with tall, mature branches and leaves, produces an excess of nutrients which it uses to propagate another stem via the rhizome. The rhizome tunnels horizontally underground for a distance before sending a shoot upwards. We then pick this immature stalk before it has a chance to mature into a tough, woody stem, which is why the bracts have not yet fully formed into leaves. However, unlike harvesting wheat or corn, which involves cutting down the entire plant and separating out the portion that we eat, harvesting these immature asparagus stalks while leaving behind the mature branches requires a significant amount of human labor. As a result, the asparagus is relatively expensive. Green asparagus contains relatively high concentrations of dimethyl sulfide, shown here on the top left, asparagusic acid, shown here on the top right, and a variety of other sulfur-containing compounds. The asparagusic acid is metabolized in our bodies into methane thiol, shown on the bottom left, which is then excreted in urine. Now, our noses are extremely sensitive to methane thiol, and like most sulfur-containing compounds, methane thiol elicits a significant instinctual avoidance response in us. The methane that makes up the majority of natural gas that many of us use in our furnaces, stoves, and ovens is odorless to us. But of course, a natural gas leak poses a significant fire hazard, so we want to be able to smell it easily. So we add methane thiol at a concentration of less than 10 parts per million into our methane. And since our noses can smell it at concentrations as low as 1.6 parts per billion, we can still smell it even when it gets diluted into the air. Now, you might be saying to yourself that while you can certainly smell the methane thiol in natural gas, it's certainly not an overpowering smell. And you'd be right because it's at such a low concentration that you typically smell it at. While I was in graduate school, one of my lab mates was working with methane thiol. He accidentally released a very small amount, just a few milliliters of it, into the lab. Now, chemistry labs are usually designed to have lots of ventilation and to not recirculate the air. Instead, the air is vented outside the building and then replaced with fresh air. Despite this, The smell from even that small amount of methane thiol was so bad that the building had to be evacuated for a few hours. Now, due to genetic differences, a small minority of people do not metabolize the sulfur compounds into methane thiol. This means that their pee doesn't smell after eating asparagus. And there's another small minority of people that cannot smell methane thiol. This is generally a different group of people than the first group, so their pee does smell, but they just don't know it. There are a variety of other stem and stalk vegetables that we're going to simply mention but not get into detail about. For example, some relatives of carrots such as celery and fennel. Also, kohlrabi and rutabaga, bamboo shoots, which grow similar to the asparagus shoots, and hearts of palm, cactus pads, shown here being eaten by two tortoises, and cardoons, fiddleheads, which are named after the curled scroll of a violin, and the red-colored stem of rhubarb. And finally, sea beans and sprouts. Now, since the sprouts are so young, they're tender because their stems haven't had time to develop the fibrous tissue that makes the mature stem so tough and woody. Okay, let's turn back to discuss legumes in more detail. Legumes are the third largest family of flowering plants after the orchid and the daisy. What makes legumes stand out is that they have a particularly high protein content. They have 2 to 3 times as much protein as rice and wheat. We've seen the internal structure of grains such as corn and wheat before, so let's compare and contrast the structure of the bean to those grains. Where the grains store the energy in the endosperm, beans store the energy in the cotyledon. In both, the embryo eventually grows into the leaves and the stem. The depression in the side of the beans forms the roots of the plant. Like the grains, the bean is protected by the seed coat, a tough outer layer that contains lots of fiber and pigments. Most legumes are largely protein and starch. There are a few exceptions, however, as peanuts and soybeans are 50% and 25% oil, respectively. But in addition to the protein and starch, many legumes have high concentrations of defensive chemicals. These defensive chemicals, combined with a tough seed coat, mean that animals fed only raw beans don't get enough calories to survive and actually will lose weight. The cooking process decomposes the chemical defenses and softens the seed coat to allow more energy and nutrients to be removed during digestion. We've already seen the wide variety of different colors that legumes can be, and we said that the primary location of those pigments is in the seed coat. Those pigments are either from chlorophyll, in the case of green colors, or from anthocyanins in the case of red or black colors. There are some beans, however, such as the white cannellini beans on the bottom right of this image, that contain very few pigment molecules and so appear white or a very pale yellow. The chlorophyll isn't affected by cooking, so the green legumes won't change color with heat. However, the anthocyanins that provide the red and black colors are generally water-soluble. This means that mottled colors will generally spread into a faded, smoothly colored bean, and solid colors will generally survive cooking, although they may become somewhat faded. The color alteration can generally be minimized by cooking in just enough water to cover the beans. If more water is used, then more of the pigment molecules will dissolve in the water and the coloring will fade to a greater extent. Let's now turn to one particular legume, the soybean. There are a number of studies linking countries with high soybean consumption with lower rates of heart disease and cancer. However, whenever you see a claim such as this, you should be careful to remember that correlation is not causation. A correlation is a mathematical relationship seen between two variables. When looking at a population, if an individual does more A, then they're more likely to also do more B. But this doesn't necessarily mean that A causes B or vice versa. For example, there is a correlation between the amount of exercise a person gets and their likelihood of developing skin cancer. But this doesn't mean that exercise causes skin cancer. Rather, those people who exercise tend to do so outside, and so they tend to be exposed to higher amounts of sunlight. It's that higher amount of sunlight that causes the increased skin cancer risk. So, with the soybean consumption and lower rates of heart disease and cancer, we don't know whether the soybeans are causing the improved health effects or whether something else is causing the improved health. For example, suppose that people in country A eat more soybeans than people in country B, but that citizens of A also get more exercise on average than citizens of B. The difference in exercise activity would be expected to cause a difference in rates of heart disease and cancer. Proving that one action causes another when dealing with a system as complicated as the human body is a rather challenging task, and it's because of this that scientific progress can seem to take such a long time and be quite expensive. We need to control for a truly huge number of variables that could potentially impact the results, and that requires carefully designed experiments, large numbers of human test subjects, and long time frames, especially when dealing with health issues such as heart disease and cancer, which may not show up for decades. One thing we know for sure is that soybeans contain a lot of saponins. Saponins are soap-like defensive chemicals. Just like the egg white proteins we discussed when making meringues, these saponins stabilize bubble walls, allowing a foam to form. This means that a pot of boiling soybeans will easily boil over as the steam bubbles up to the surface. But these saponins also happen to bind to cholesterol, so the digestive system can't absorb it as efficiently. And soybeans also contain phytosterols, which are chemical relatives of cholesterol that further interfere with cholesterol absorption. So you might be thinking that this could cause the decrease in heart disease in populations that consume more soybeans. However, recent studies have shown that dietary cholesterol may not be that bad for us after all. That is, while we know that higher levels of cholesterol in the bloodstream is unhealthy, it appears that eating foods higher in cholesterol doesn't increase cholesterol levels in the blood to the extent that we had suspected. Instead, there are both good and bad forms of cholesterol, and our bodies make most of the cholesterol that appears in our bloodstream. As a result, it appears that our individual genetics has far more to do with the levels of cholesterol in our blood than does our diet. As I've said before, though, I'm not a medical doctor, and nothing I'm saying here should be taken as medical advice. You should only take medical advice from trained medical professionals. Now, beans have a problem that many school children love to discuss. They cause us to produce extra gas or flatulence when we eat them. Where does this unpleasant flatulence come from? Our bodies don't digest our food without some help. We have a variety of different bacteria in our digestive system that help to break down the food we eat and allow us to get more nutrition out of that food. But these bacteria also produce waste products just like we do. And one of those waste products is about a quart of gas each day that needs to be released from our digestive system. But many legumes, especially soy, navy, and lima beans, cause a dramatic increase in bacterial activity and therefore gas production for a few hours after consumption. This is because they contain large amounts of carbohydrates, mostly in the form of oligosaccharides, that our digestive systems can't break down into absorbable sugars. These carbohydrates leave the upper digestive system and are broken down by bacteria in the lower digestive system. The upper digestive system is everything from the mouth through the esophagus and stomach to the first part of the small intestine. The lower digestive system is the remainder of the small intestine and the large intestine. Once these carbohydrates make it out of the stomach, it is difficult for our bodies to vent the gas produced via the mouth by burping, and so the gas instead comes out the other end, and of course it brings with it a variety of other volatile molecules that don't smell particularly pleasant. So what can we do to reduce the flatulence caused by eating beans? Boiling quickly and then letting the beans sit for an hour allows most of the water-soluble oligosaccharides to dissolve into the cooking water. If we then discard the water and replace with fresh water, most of those oligosaccharides will be removed, and so most of the gas production will be eliminated. However, there is a downside as a variety of other valuable nutrients, flavors, colors, and antioxidants will also be water soluble and therefore will also be removed. But for the comfort of those around you, this may be a worthwhile trade-off. However, instead of discarding the soaking water, if the beans are simply boiled for longer, the oligosaccharides and other indigestible carbohydrates, largely cell wall structural carbohydrates, will be broken down. Since these simpler carbohydrate breakdown products are largely absorbed in the upper digestive tract, there will be far less food for the bacteria in the lower digestive tract to turn into gas. Another alternative is to allow the bean to germinate or ferment as these oligosaccharides are consumed during either process. So foods such as bean sprouts, miso, and soy sauce are much less likely to lead to gas. Beans usually take a long time to cook because they absorb water slowly, largely because of their tough outer seed coat. Unfortunately, a rolling boil will damage that seed coat, so beans are best cooked at lower and therefore slower temperatures of between 180 and 200 degrees Fahrenheit. This makes beans ideal for cooking in a slow cooker or a crock pot. But one of the challenges of cooking beans is that they take a long time to soften and cook, but then they can quickly become over soft and mushy. Thus, cooking beans takes a balance of softening enough, but not too much. Many cookbooks claim that adding salt to the cooking water prevents the beans from softening. Salt does indeed slow the rate at which beans will absorb water, but the beans will eventually absorb it and soften. And once those softened beans are cooked, they cook faster than beans pre-soaked in water without salt. Acids make the cell wall pectins and hemicelluloses more stable and less dissolvable. This means that adding acid will slow the softening of the beans, whereas adding a base will speed up the softening of the beans. So we can add acidic ingredients like tomatoes to slow the cooking of the beans, which can be very useful in slow cooker recipes. The savory taste of the tomatoes also pairs well with the high protein beans, so the tomatoes can serve a dual purpose in the chili. Sugar reinforces the cell wall and slows the swelling of the starch granules, so again, adding sugar will slow down the softening of the beans. As we've seen before, calcium ions increase the cross-linking of proteins such as the cell wall pectins. So cooking in hard water or water to which we've added sea salt will slow the softening process. Some ingredients can take advantage of more than one way to slow the softening of the beans. For example, molasses contains acid, lots of sugar, and calcium, so it can significantly increase the cooking time and is therefore often used in circumstances in which the beans will be heated for long times before serving, such as in a slow cooker or on a buffet line. However, sometimes you don't want to wait all day for beans to cook and you want to cook them faster. This can be especially true if you're at higher altitudes where the boiling point of water is lower, so the softening process will take even longer. Pre-soaking the beans reduces the cooking time by about 25%. The medium-sized beans will absorb half their water capacity within about 2 hours and can double their original weight in about 10 to 12 hours of soaking. You can also significantly speed up the soaking process by blanching the beans for a minute and a half to hydrate the seed coat and then soaking the beans for 2 to 3 hours in cool water. Again, salt speeds up the cooking of the beans, as the sodium ions replace magnesium ions in the cell wall pectins and makes them dissolve much more easily. So if you wait to add the salt until just before cooking, that is, if you don't add the salt during the pre-soak, the beans will cook faster. You can also use baking soda as it packs a 1-2 punch. It's a base, so it aids in dissolving the cell wall hemicelluloses. But the chemical name of baking soda is sodium bicarbonate, so it contains sodium ions that will displace the magnesium ions in the pectins. Together, these two effects lower the cooking time by about 75%. However, there are downsides to using salt and baking soda. Salt reduces the swelling and gelation of the starch granules in the beans, so they'll have a more mealy texture instead of a creamy internal texture. And the alkalinity provides a slippery texture as well as a bitter taste. Remember that most soaps are bases, which is part of why they feel slippery and taste bitter. If you ever used a naughty word as a child and your mother washed out your mouth with soap like mine did, you know just how awful soap tastes. Luckily though, we have one more way to increase the cooking speed of beans. Remember from the last video that if we increase the pressure above a liquid, the boiling point of that liquid increases. So if we use a pressure cooker to cook the beans, the increased pressure means that the water inside will boil at a higher temperature. And that higher temperature means that the beans will cook faster, in roughly half the time. If we combine a pressure cooker with beans pre-soaked in salt water, we can cook them in about 10 minutes. But boiling isn't the only way we cook legumes. Some legumes are also roasted without using water. These tend to be the oily ones, such as peanuts, since that oil prevents the cooked bean from feeling too dry. Now let's turn to one particular bean, the fava bean. Fava beans have a thick, tough seed coat that is often removed before eating. But eating fava beans can cause a serious disease called favism in people with an inherited deficiency in a particular enzyme. Two of the amino acids in the beans, visine and convisine, are metabolized to forms that damage the red blood cells. This damage to the red blood cells causes anemia, a lack of oxygen supplied to tissues. Anemia can be fatal, especially for small children. Now you'd think that natural selection would have caused such a deadly mutation to be removed from the population. Ironically, the genes that encode this enzyme deficiency have not been selected out in the southern Mediterranean and Middle East precisely because it causes anemia. Historically, these regions had rampant malaria. Shown here is a map of modern malaria rates showing high incidence in Central and South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southern Asia. Malaria is caused by a parasitic protozoa carried by mosquitoes. When a mosquito bites a human, the mosquito injects an anticoagulant into the blood to prevent blood clots from forming, so that the mosquito can drink more of our blood. But when it injects that anticoagulant, the malaria protozoa can go along for the ride and make it into our bloodstream, where it infects red blood cells. Once inside a red blood cell, it reproduces wildly until the now much larger number of protozoa burst out of the cell, killing the red blood cell, and go in search of other cells to infect. Now, even when they're not infected, red blood cells don't last forever in the body. After a few months, they get removed by the body and recycled. The alteration of the hemoglobin due to the mutation that causes favism increases the likelihood that the red blood cell will be recycled in this way. So it reduces the time that the protozoa have to reproduce, causing the malaria infection to be less severe and therefore decreasing the likelihood that the infected person will die. This positive evolutionary pressure from malaria has served to offset the negative evolutionary pressure due to favism for those with this genetic mutation, which is why its prevalence has not decreased over time. But malaria has also caused selective pressure on the human genome with another genetic mutation, sickle cell trait and sickle cell anemia. On the bottom left, we show three different people. The first person has two normal copies of this gene without the sickle cell trait, symbolized here with an A. This person has normal red blood cells shaped somewhat like a donut without the center removed. They have a depression in their sides, but it doesn't create a hole all the way through. The second person has one normal copy of the gene and one mutated gene, symbolized with an S for sickle cell. This person is a carrier, that is, they have sickle cell trait. Their red blood cells are also normal. The third person has two copies of the mutated gene. This person's red blood cells are likely to curve into a sickle shape like the letter C. When the cells sickle, they are much more likely to be recycled by the body. This results in significantly fewer red blood cells because the body simply can't replace them fast enough. And with fewer red blood cells to carry oxygen comes anemia, a lack of oxygen to the body's tissues. So people with two copies of the sickle cell gene have sickle cell anemia. This lowers their life expectancy, which would normally cause the mutation to become more rare over time. But people with only one copy of the sickle cell gene have normal red blood cells, so they do not have this negative evolutionary pressure. Furthermore, their red blood cells that are infected by the malaria protozoa are more likely to sickle than red blood cells from an individual with two normal copies of the gene. This means that those with only one copy of the gene are less likely to die from malaria, thereby increasing their life expectancy if malaria is prevalent. As a result, the sickle cell gene is common in regions with high malaria rates. Again, the bottom map shows the malaria rates across the world, and the top map shows the incidence of this mutation in populations across the world. These two maps show overlap with relatively high incidence of the mutation in Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, Southern Asia, and Central and South America. In regions of the world in which malaria is rare, this gene was largely removed from the population. But in regions in which malaria poses a significant threat, the gene didn't disappear. The incidence is still relatively low at well under 1% of the population because having two copies of the gene would historically have been rather deadly due to sickle cell anemia. So if your ancestors are from one of these regions, you should be aware that you have a somewhat higher risk of carrying this gene.